December 19th, 1944. The Ardennes forest burns under a low, iron sky. Snow falls in thick, greasy flakes, blackened by smoke and cordite. A line of German Panzers lies crippled in a crossroads ditch, their steel hulls glowing like the ribs of some mechanical beast cut open by artillery. Through the haze, a figure moves, hunched, helmet glinting, Red Cross armband bright against soot and blood. He laughs. Not the laugh of madness, but of something unbreakable. Dry. Ragged. Alive. As shells land close, his boots crunch through ice and shattered glass. He drags another man from the fire, then another, his gloved hands already blistered beneath the wool. German riflemen watch from the tree line, fingers frozen on triggers. One whispers in disbelief, "Der Geist!" The ghost. By nightfall, 12 men, American and German alike, lie breathing again because that single medic refused to stop. Around him, the battle still roars, yet his laughter cuts through it all, steady as heartbeat, drawing us back to how such a moment could exist amid Europe's final winter of war. By late 1944, the war in Europe seemed to be grinding toward inevitable Allied victory. Yet few on the ground felt anywhere close to triumph. The Western Front had transformed into a cold, sprawling labyrinth of forests, rivers, and cratered towns. After the breakout from Normandy and the liberation of Paris, the Allied advance had raced across northern France faster than even its commanders expected. But speed carried exhaustion in its shadow. Men, machines, and fuel lines were stretched thin. Winter crept in before logistics could catch up, and the euphoria of summer victories froze into endurance under a December sky. The German army, bloodied but not broken, had retreated into the dense Ardennes, the same forest they'd once used for lightning invasion. Now they planned to strike back, to split the Allied front and force a recall to negotiation. Under Adolf Hitler's direction, the Wehrmacht gathered what remained of its armored might for a desperate gamble, one that would come to be known as the Ardennes Offensive, or to the Allies, the Battle of the Bulge. In quiet villages like Bastogne, St. Vith, and Clairvaux, civilians huddled in cellars as columns of panzers crawled east to west, engines whining beneath tarps to avoid detection. Among those waiting for the blow were units such as the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions, the 101st Airborne, and infantry regiments from Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana, thousands of young men who had never seen a European winter before. Inside each formation marched a small group of soldiers who carried neither rifles nor grenades. They were the medics, bearers of Red Cross patches, field dressings, and hope. While others held rifles at the ready, medics moved behind and beside the front line, constantly evaluating who might still live long enough to be saved. They were trained to remain calm amid catastrophe, to measure pulse rates while artillery thundered meters away. Combat medicine in 1944 was both refined and archaic. Penicillin had begun reaching front lines only months earlier, and morphine had to be rationed. Battalion aid stations, makeshift tents in barns or bombed-out chapels, could stabilize the wounded, but rarely transport them quickly enough. Evacuation jeeps slogged through mud and snow, their white-painted crosses drawing sniper fire despite Geneva protections. For many medics, survival was an act of contradiction. They were unarmed by doctrine, protected by law, yet often more exposed than any rifleman. The Geneva Convention marked them as neutral, but in the chaos of battle, neutrality was as fragile as snow on tank armor. Some German units respected the symbol. Others, hardened by months of terror bombing, did not. In letters home, American medics spoke about laughter as medicine of its own, the strange reflex that cut through dread. "You laugh, or you freeze," one wrote from the 9th Armored Division. This grim humor was misinterpreted at times by those who saw it. To laugh amid dying men looked insane, yet to stop laughing meant surrendering the mind. The line between coping and collapse was as thin as a pulse under numbed fingertips. The medic we center on, known later by his comrades as the Ghost, belonged to one such frontline clearing unit attached to a mechanized infantry battalion along the southern shoulder of the Bulge. His name would fade from records, not through conspiracy, but through the flood of chaos that erased lesser-known heroes. What remained was testimony, recollections from fellow medics, signal corpsmen, and even captured Germans who remembered an American who laughed in the fire. As frost thickened and communications broke down, isolated aid stations became solitary islands of compassion in a white ocean of hostility. Each carried the weight of dozens of lives, triage by candlelight, morphine doses counted like currency. And looming over everyone was the sound, the grinding approach of engines signaling that the German counteroffensive had begun. Within that mechanical storm, the Ghost would soon face his defining test. The Ardennes campaign was fought not only in trenches and towns, but in the minds of men rapidly unraveling under strain. What made this battle so punishing was its combination of terrain, weather, and disbelief. December 1944 entered the record books as one of the coldest winters in living memory. Snow fell so heavily that units disappeared into whiteness only a few dozen yards away. Engines froze. Field dressing stiffened into boards. Radios shorted out. Yet both sides kept fighting because they had no choice. For the Americans, the hills of Belgium and Luxembourg were the final gateway into Germany. For the Germans, the region represented a last chance to alter the war's fate. Inside command dugouts, planners on both sides drew neat arrows across maps, unaware that plans would be devoured by the blizzard outside. Among those enduring it were the medical detachments of the U.S. Army, unsung technicians of humanity. Their organization was precise. Every regiment maintained an aid station. Each battalion, a team of doctors, medics, and litter bearers. But as the German surprise offensive erupted on 16th of December, the system fractured instantly. Columns were cut off, aid stations overrun, supply routes buried under shell splinters and snowdrifts. Official doctrine told medics to prioritize mobility and neutrality. On paper, both sounded achievable. In practice, neutrality vanished when machine guns chattered and shells rained blind across front lines. Many medics carried a sidearm despite regulations, not to fight, but to protect wounded patients from execution or capture. Most hoped they would never need to pull it. Evacuation routes grew so perilous that wounded men sometimes remained under fire for hours, even days. "We built our hospital by intuition," one surgeon later wrote. "Wherever there was less noise, we set up the cot." The flow of casualties from the Bulge was staggering. Nearly 90,000 American wounded during 6 weeks of combat. Overwhelming medical resources that had been designed for half that number. Ambulance drivers risked mines to shuttle stretchers toward rearward field hospitals. Some disappeared entirely in snow-buried wrecks discovered only after thaw. Across the line, German medics wrestled with similar impossibilities. Limited fuel and air superiority meant evacuation by horse sleigh, and many German doctors treated American prisoners alongside their own. In such pockets of decency, war temporarily halted. It was in one of these rare, humane interruptions that the legend of the laughing medic first took hold, whispered among surprised German infantrymen who had seen an American crossing no man's land, to drag out not only his friends, but their wounded comrades. Psychiatrists attached to the U.S. Army Medical Department later described battlefield laughter as a displacement mechanism, a nervous vent releasing the pressure of constant trauma. Soldiers muttered about hysteria, but the behavior helped some remain functional. Historians analyzing post-war diaries found strikingly similar patterns. Gallows humor, house-shaking laughter inside casualty shelters, absurd nicknames for wounds. Amid carnage, these were anchors of sanity. Behind every episode of courage lay the structure of training. Medics were drilled relentlessly, learning to locate arterial bleeds in darkness, to stop pneumothoraxes with improvised valves cut from cigarette wrappers, to distinguish between survivable and fatal injuries in seconds. Theirs was a discipline of triage, where mercy had to be balanced against cold arithmetic. The Ghost, like thousands of his peers, internalized those calculations until instinct replaced fear. By mid-December, Allied intelligence realized that what began as a limited counterattack was an all-out offensive. Rundstedts and Manteuffel's armored spearheads tore through thinly manned American lines, encircling entire regiments. Bastogne was besieged, fuel depots were seized or destroyed. Artillery shells fell faster than snowflakes. Those caught on the roads became moving targets, convoys of aid jeeps among them. Each night, illumination flares painted the forest in green and red. For every explosion, there was a scramble of medics searching for life. Stars of tracer fire carved constellations overhead as they crawled through ice to reach cries in the dark. It was amid this frozen apocalypse that the figure known as the Ghost would perform the action later spoken of with disbelief. Laughing through the inferno of a shattered Panzer line, refusing to choose sides when breath still stirred a broken body. That moment, still days away, was being shaped by everything the men of the medical corps had endured until now. Exhaustion, discipline, and a faint, stubborn hope that saving one more life still mattered. The story of the laughing medic does not live solely in one act of heroism. It rests upon overlapping perspectives, each revealing a layer of meaning within the same frozen landscape. The first angle belongs to those who knew him personally, fellow medics, stretcher-bearers, and infantrymen who spent weeks sharing the same foxholes and whispered exhaustion. They remembered a wiry figure who carried himself with peculiar calm. While others cursed the endless cold, he cracked grim jokes about luxury winter vacations in Belgium. His laughter wasn't giddy, it was steady, like the rhythm of a heart refusing to quicken. That composure was magnetic. A wounded soldier could focus on the sound instead of the chaos. A strange soundtrack promising that someone still had control. To be a combat medic in 1944 meant walking the seam between compassion and stoicism. They were forbidden to weep openly, lest fear spread down the line. Instead, they mastered controlled response, checking pulses with gloved fingers that could barely feel, cutting uniforms off wounds only to reuse the same blood-soaked bandages on the next casualty. Every motion had to be efficient, because time, not pain, was the real enemy. Within that system, humor became the last bastion of humanity. A joke about army coffee at the moment of amputation might prevent a soldier from fainting long enough for morphine to take effect. It wasn't mockery, it was defiance. The Ghost reportedly used laughter that way, a sound so unexpected under fire that it disrupted panic itself. Fellow medics later said, "He laughed so men would breathe." Beyond morale, battlefield medicine shaped tactics more than most commanders admitted. Units fought differently when they trusted evacuation to work. A platoon advancing into woods where medics could reach them was statistically less likely to break under shelling. Commanders like General Omar Bradley understood this psychological geometry. Rescuing one man saved 10 from paralysis by fear. During the Bulge, this principle was tested fiercely. Snow left stretchers immobile. Jeeps spun out. Medics were forced to improvise sleds, door frames, even gutter pipes as skids. The Ghost's sector, near a network of small fire breaks south of Bastogne, became notorious for ambushes that cut off medical routes. Nearby artillery officers described seeing stretcher teams disappear into foliage and not return for hours, yet the wounded kept arriving at aid stations. Someone out there was bringing them in. At times, the medic's appearance itself altered engagements. German snipers who spotted the Red Cross armband occasionally hesitated, uncertain whether to fire. That heartbeat of indecision could mean survival for those around him. Witness accounts of a figure moving in smoke, bare-handed, laughing, reflect both legend and real confusion under combat vision. This blur between myth and visibility, where a man becomes both target and symbol, is the tactical paradox of battlefield mercy. Fear behaves oddly when confronted by serenity. German prisoners interviewed after the war confessed that they found certain American behaviors unnerving, not for aggression, but for compassion. One captured Feldwebel recounted that he had aimed at a medic kneeling beside a wounded comrade, only to stop when the American suddenly looked up and grinned as if daring the universe to object. It was madness, he said, and sacred. For the medic himself, laughter warded off shock. The human nervous system cannot sustain terror indefinitely. It seeks release. Where some shouted or prayed, he laughed, a reflex that protected awareness, allowing him to function under stress that might cripple others. Medical officers today would classify it as stress inoculation, a precursor to the trained calm modern combat medics display. No man performs such acts in isolation. Surrounding our medic were aid station comrades who carried plasma bottles through sleet, ambulance drivers coaxing engines to life with fumes of gasoline, and orderlies who endured the psychological burden of triage, choosing who lived and died. Their collective professionalism created an environment where individual heroics could bloom. In letters later collected by families, other medics referred affectionately to the man who made the wounded laugh. None knew his official record. No medal citation mentions the precise event, but their accounts align on tone. A half-smile amid fury, a joke shouted over the whistle of incoming rounds, and then a trail of living men left in his wake. When combined, these angles form more than anecdote. They illustrate a principle of wartime resilience, that composure itself can be as potent as weaponry. And as the German counteroffensive surged, this human, tactical, and psychological fusion would soon meet its most brutal test: the attack that transformed a nameless medic into a whispered legend among enemies. Battlefield medicine is often defined by what cannot be carried. In the winter of 1944, technology followed the same constraints. A medic's equipment had to fit inside a canvas haversack. Morphine syrettes, sulfa powder, plasma bottles, small bandages, tourniquets, and scissors. Innovation appeared improvised rather than engineered. Litter sleds built from ammunition boxes or tank track covers kept the wounded sliding over snow when wheels failed. In the Bastogne sector, U.S. supply officers devised airdrops of medical kits, using Red Cross parachutes so that both friend and foe would recognize them. Such ingenuity blurred lines of ownership. German troops occasionally retrieved Allied parachutes from the trees and used them to bandage their own wounded. In several cases, they delivered American plasma bottles to field hospitals once a brief ceasefire allowed evacuation. Human necessity occasionally outran political loyalty. The Ghost's gear would have reflected this stripped-down practicality, light enough to run, heavy enough to save. When later witnesses described the glint of metal under his armband, it was likely the small hemostats and clamps hanging from a web belt, catching the light like tiny swords. These were his weapons, blades that sealed rather than cut. To understand why German soldiers would preserve stories of an enemy medic, one must recall what the Ardennes offensive meant to them. Many were teenagers of the Volksgrenadier divisions or veterans pulled from hospitals to fill ranks. They expected to face demoralized opponents, but instead encountered unexpected professionalism. Allied Medical Corps, though overwhelmed, maintained efficiency that spoke of industrial momentum and moral confidence. Propaganda inside the Reich had painted Americans as coarse materialists, incapable of honor. Yet along forest edges, some Germans witnessed the opposite. Men risking death to pull strangers from fires. This inversion shattered assumptions that warfare itself tried to preserve. Observing a medic laughing under bombardment did not read as arrogance. It resembled immunity. They called him Der Geist, not from poetic flourish, but from an instinctive search for explanation. What kind of man meets annihilation with humor? Post-war interviews compiled by American intelligence revealed that such encounters weakened the morale of certain small German units. Seeing mercy practiced by enemies bred dissonance. "We felt we were fighting machines," one corporal admitted, but the machines bled like priests. In that paradox, enemy compassion as psychological weapon, the Allied ethos gained subtle power. Every soldier carried an internal tribunal. Killing within rules of engagement could be rationalized. Watching a friend die while obeying those same rules could not. Medics were the visible conscience of armies, a moving emblem that life retained some hierarchy even in chaos. The Ghost's refusal to discriminate among the wounded exemplified an older chivalric notion buried inside modern mechanized slaughter. Saving a German tanker from his own burning machine contradicted military objective, but affirmed civilization. This ethic derived not from naivete, but from law. The 1929 Geneva Convention required impartial care of wounded without distinction of nationality. While countless violations occurred, the very language of the code influenced battlefield behavior. By December 1944, many medics judged themselves first by that oath rather than by national allegiance. Their battlefield humor, discipline, and selective blindness to uniforms were practical manifestations of ethics under fire. Technology would soon evolve, but ethos lingers longer. Techniques refined by nameless medics, rapid hemorrhage control, shock treatment, forward triage, laid the groundwork for modern combat casualty care. The Ghosts episode, whether retold in barracks or war colleges, represented the ideal that speed, calm, and morale intertwine. After the Bulge, the U.S. Army conducted internal studies confirming that prompt medical response reduced non-fatal casualties by up to 35%. Behind those numbers stood individuals whose steadiness made statistics possible. In Germany's post-war archives, Allied humanitarian conduct became an unexpected benchmark during Reconstruction. Red Cross collaborations restored professional respect among former enemies. French historian Pierre Bertrand later wrote, "At the moment, civilization seemed lost. The sight of a medic laughing through fire reminded observers that the human mind still preferred life." His phrasing echoed the paradox that defined the Ghost's legend. Absurd sanity confronting organized despair. When these threads combine, ingenuity, enemy perception, moral conviction, and legacy, the figure of the laughing medic ceases to be singular. He becomes representative of the system that forged him. Advanced logistics welded to ethics, courage bound to discipline. And as the calendar turned toward Christmas 1944, this network of care would meet its decisive proving ground. For on the 19th morning of that frozen month, a column of Panzers, retreating under counter-barrage, would crash headlong into a set of American defensive positions where the Ghost's platoon was stationed. The battlefield ahead would boil with diesel fires and twisted armor. Within hours, an event would unfold that etched itself into rumor across both armies. The moment that laughter became legend. December 19, 1944. The southern edge of Bastogne sector. At first, it was only a sound. A distant mechanical grind carried on the frozen wind. Men in the forward positions recognized it instantly. Tank treads biting ice. The early dawn was pale blue, the temperature far below freezing. Visibility was poor, yet growing light outlined black silhouettes among spruce trees, the shapes of approaching Panzers. Artillery warnings crackled over field radios, Fragment 6 reports shuffling like paper ghosts across the frequency. Within minutes, German shells began tearing through the American defensive perimeter, bursting snow into geysers of white earth. Infantrymen dove for cover behind splintered trees. Machine gun nests returned fire. The air thickened with smoke that clung to everything, turning morning into twilight. Inside a shallow ravine near the front line, the Ghost and 3 other medics had set up a temporary clearing station barely shielded by upturned jeeps. It wasn't meant for sustained combat, only to stabilize the wounded before evacuation. Now evacuation was impossible. The access road behind them was already under bombardment. When the first wave of corpsmen arrived, dragging casualties by their shoulders, the medic went to work immediately. There was no time for formal triage. One American with shattered femurs lay moaning through a frozen scarf. A German tanker, ejected from his burning vehicle, begged in his own dialect for water. The ghost moved between them as though uniforms had no color. He knelt beside each man, voice low but steady. Those who could hear him noticed that he laughed softly between instructions, a sound like the cracking of ice under pressure, strangely humanizing the inferno. At earweight 15 hours, one of the disabled Panzers nearby ignited completely. Ammunition within the hull began detonating like fireworks, scattering molten metal across the snowfield. The blast flung smoke so thick that men couldn't see their own boots. Within that burning fog, cries for help multiplied. Someone shouted, "We got more alive in there!" Another voice answered, "You can't reach them!" And then they saw him move. Reports from both sides would later describe the same image. A single medic sprinting across 50 yards of open field, weaving through fire bursts, his armband gleaming faintly in the half-light. German machine guns ceased firing for a moment, not from mercy, but from pure confusion. Through binoculars, an officer barked orders, yet even he hesitated as the figure vanished into flames. Inside the wrecked column, the medic dug through twisted steel. The air was a furnace laced with cordite. Through the crackle of burning paint came muffled voices. He crawled beneath one of the hulls where a crewman was pinned, yanked debris away, and used his last tourniquet on a half-severed leg. The man lost consciousness instantly, but lived long enough to be dragged clear. Witnesses from an adjacent American platoon later recalled that the medic's laughter echoed between detonations. It wasn't hysteria. It was rhythm, marking seconds like a metronome while he counted where to run next. Another explosion hurled a track plate over his head. He rolled, still clutching a plasma bottle, then kept moving. When a second Panzer turret blew apart, he dove beneath the carcass, pulling two unconscious men toward cover. Snow hissed as metal dripped molten around them. The miracle was not only his courage, but the strange ceasefire it produced. Accounts mention German soldiers lowering their weapons, shouting for him to stop, partly to save him, partly to comprehend what they were seeing. That temporary pause lasted barely minutes before the broader battle swallowed it again. But in that sliver of silence, 12 human beings, Americans and Germans alike, were alive who minutes earlier seemed doomed. Back at the aid station, assistants worked frantically to keep the rescued breathing. Plasma bottles hung from rifle barrels driven into the ground. One corporal recalled that amid the chaos, the medic burst in carrying another man over his shoulders, dropped him onto a blanket, grinned through a face streaked with soot, and said something about needing a bigger waiting room. Then he turned and went out again. By noon, smoke blotted out the sun. Artillery from both sides now pounded the valley relentlessly. When finally relieved by reinforcements from a neighboring regiment, the medic could barely stand. His clothing was scorched, his gloves black and stiff. But none of the 12 he had carried from the wrecks were dead. That day's action would later be summarized in terse field notes. Aidman repeatedly entered area of enemy armor while under heavy fire, performed treatment and evacuation, disregarding own safety. No official citation mentions laughter, yet those who heard it swore that sound was what kept them moving when reason said, "Stop." It was an affirmation in defiance of the entire frozen battlefield, a declaration that sanity remained possible. The legend of the ghost began that morning, spreading across shattered lines as exhausted soldiers attempted to explain impossible calm. But the battle for the Bulge was far from over, and night would soon fall on a field still burning, with the medic's story not yet finished. As daylight bled away, the forest transformed again. The snow, once dazzling white, turned ash-gray beneath a ceiling of rolling smoke. Trees stood charred and bent, their branches stripped by shrapnel. Between them, wounded men crawled toward flickers of lantern light, calling weakly for Doc. Yotisid, the ghost, had returned from the inferno with his uniform torn in several places, the red cross barely visible beneath soot. His hands shook, though not from fear. The muscles simply refused to rest after 8 hours of labor. At the edge of the aid station, he sank briefly against a tree trunk, exhaled, and let out that quiet, unmistakable laugh. Each breath looked like steam escaping an engine too hot to cool. Around him, chaos continued its rhythm. A mortar round exploded 200 yards away, sending a rain of ice through the air like broken glass. An ambulance jeep skidded sideways into a ditch, frozen wheels locked. The temperature hovered near 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Medics wrapped blankets around semi-conscious soldiers, placed heat tabs under stretchers, and prayed the road to Bastogne would reopen soon. At 16:30 hours, word came, counterattack expected. The remnants of the German armored assault regrouped for one more push along the same road where the earlier wrecks still burned. From captured prisoners, the Americans learned that infantry units had been ordered to retrieve the surviving tank crews, the very men the ghost had dragged from fire. In effect, both sides were now converging on the same patch of earth for opposite reasons. Rescue and retrieval colliding within the same kill zone. When darkness thickened, flares ignited the forest with sickly green glow. The medics saw silhouettes moving toward them and readied stretchers in case of renewed fighting. Then, through the drifting snow, came a sound no one anticipated. The German wounded calling out toward their comrades, shouting that they were alive. The language crossed lines, momentarily confusing everyone. The ghost seized the opportunity. Carrying a flashlight covered with red cloth, he moved forward to guide rescue teams from both directions to a small neutral clearing between the lines. Witnesses insist that brief ceasefire actually occurred. For roughly 20 minutes, intermittent fire stopped. Americans, Germans, and one Belgian civilian medic carried stretchers together. Each side kept its rifles slung, glancing at one another as if glimpsing their own reflections. The ghost directed the narrow corridor with gestures, placing surviving tankers onto sleds, ensuring that American and German wounded separated only once they were safe from shells. Then the illusion collapsed. Artillery from distant batteries, unaware of local truce, resumed bombardment. The re-emerging thunder stunned the valley. Men scattered, dragging patients into ditches. Amid the shell bursts, the ghost was seen running back and forth, shouting coordinates to a signalman, trying to warn gunners to lift fire. Nobody could hear him. One shell struck near the clearing, throwing dirt across his back. When smoke cleared, he kept moving, carrying one last man, a young American radio operator with both legs broken. The retreat toward friendly positions became a crawl through overlapping barrages. For several minutes, the medic disappeared entirely behind dense curtains of smoke. Those waiting at the aid post feared he had been killed. Then, as illumination rounds flared overhead, a shape materialized through falling ash, stooped, burdened, but upright. With each step, his boots sank deep, his breath visible in ragged bursts. When he reached the edge of the perimeter, he set the radio operator down and laughed again, a hoarse, exhausted sound that reminded everyone present that he was somehow still alive. Only after the wounded were secured did his legs buckle. Other medics caught him before he fell fully into the snow. His gloves were fused to his fingers from heat exposure. His parka smoked faintly from singed fabric. Without ceremony, they treated their own healer. Hands in burns, glass fragment extracted from his shoulder, IV line inserted by trembling peers. In the dark beyond the tents, the echoes of combat receded over the next hours. American reinforcements stabilized the sector. By dawn, the fields of twisted armor were silent, streams of vapor rising from molten metal that crackled under new frost. Of the 12 lives saved under fire, 10 would later survive transport to rear hospitals. 2 succumbed within days, their names recorded beside countless others. Yet it was widely said they died smiling, comforted by the memory of laughter amid hell. When senior officers inspected the site later that week, they documented nothing of the legend that had already begun growing among foot soldiers. Official paperwork listed casualty numbers, ammunition expenditures, and damage to vehicles. But rumor travels faster than ink, and by Christmas, the name Ghost circulated from Bastogne to Liège. Even captured Germans repeated it, claiming the phantom medic had laughed in smoke. The turning point of that winter offensive was not measured solely in territorial lines regained or tanks destroyed. For those who witnessed the event, the transformation came within themselves. The realization that compassion could momentarily tame even the largest. Battle of the Western Front. The Ghosts. Defiance altered morale as surely as any artillery bombardment. It whispered that human decency still functioned inside a world that had mechanically forgotten the word mercy. And with the valley finally quiet, the snow began to fall again. Clean layers covering the evidence of what had happened, sealing the story beneath an immaculate white surface that only eyewitnesses would ever truly disturb. When the guns finally fell silent across the Ardennes, the world returned first as sound. The hiss of wind, the creak of trees refreezing, the chatter of orders spoken in hoarse whisper. Out of that stunned quiet came the work of accounting. U.S. physicians and statisticians, trudging from one village to another, tallied lives saved and lost with mechanical precision. On their papers, the numbers made war seem comprehensible. More than 75,000 American casualties, roughly 67,000 German, and thousands of civilians caught between. Yet beneath those abstractions were individuals whose pulse had refused to fade. The Ghost was one of them. Carried to a rear hospital near Rochefort, he received treatment for multiple burns, frostbite, and shrapnel wounds. The chief surgeon's notes described a medic who continued demanding updates on his patients even while sedated. He stayed 2 days before slipping away without fanfare, discharged to field duty when most expected his evacuation to England. By then, stories about his actions had reached higher headquarters. In an interview conducted weeks later by the Army Medical Corps historian, several witnesses independently recounted laughter under continuous fire. Their consistent tone convinced investigators this was no legend manufactured for morale, though the man himself resisted interviews. When pressed, he dismissed the incident. "I was just trying to keep warm." Within days of his return to duty, victory at Bastogne became public knowledge. Newsreels hailed Patton's Third Army relief, the stubborn defense that turned the tide of the Ardennes offensive. Official citations showered famous names, but the majority of heroism vanished into collective anonymity. Drivers, engineers, signalmen, surgeons, stretcher-bearers. The Ghost belonged to that quiet legion. Meanwhile, German survivors evacuated through captured supply routes brought their own fragmented version of events. Intelligence units intercepted letters describing an American medic unharmed by flame, rumored to have rescued both friend and foe. These letters, later stored in Allied intelligence archives, unintentionally preserved the myth from both perspectives. German awe complementing American understatement. The Ghost's behavior also highlighted uncomfortable truths about the limits of convention. Headquarters debates rekindled around how much protection Red Cross insignia truly provided. Reports from the Bulge proved that medics faced deliberate targeting as often as mercy. Statistical analysis after the war revealed medical personnel suffered casualty rates nearly equal to infantry line troops in high-intensity combat. The myth of safety under the sign of neutrality collapsed amid empirical evidence. Psychologically, however, the story had opposite effect on morale. Chaplains invoked the laughing medic in sermons about faith under pressure. One division newsletter printed a cartoon of a grinning corpsman bandaging a cannon. The humor was crude but affectionate, a small totem of reassurance. In January 1945, the Ghosts Battalion rotated through Luxembourg for rest. Photographs show a cluster of medics standing outside a stone farmhouse, smiling at the camera. None are labeled by name. Historians later compared the images, guessing which face might belong to him, though certainty proved impossible. What mattered was not identification, but echo. Proof that even temporary salvation had consequences beyond statistics. That winter's frozen valleys thawed into mud by March. Streams carried remnants of battle, spent cases, boot soles, pieces of torn canvas marked with faded red paint. When spring enveloped the Ardennes woods again, villagers began unearthing grave markers and remnants of medical stations, symbols of destruction softened by birdsong. To them, tales of compassion offered equilibrium to memory. They spoke of the laughing medic as one reason the ground felt retaken not only by armies, but by humanity itself. The ghost's physical trail soon vanishes in documentation. Whether he survived the remainder of the war or returned home anonymously is unknown. But his influence persisted, woven into the practice and identity of combat medicine. An invisible standard to which generations would quietly measure themselves. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Command Headquarters issued a wide review of frontline medical performance. The data confirmed what many soldiers had witnessed firsthand. Wherever medics held their composure, casualty survival leapt dramatically. The Ardennes campaign proved that calm under fire could be as decisive as artillery. Within months, lessons from that winter were distilled into new doctrine. Field surgical units positioned closer to combat zones, helicopter evacuation prototypes in the Pacific, and formal training on battlefield stress management. The anonymous medic, unofficially called the Ghost, embodied those lessons before they had names. In debriefs, officers cited his case when discussing why morale sometimes outweighed materiel. Colonel Albert Cowdrey, writing decades later as an official U.S. Army medical historian, observed that the Bulge showed how courage and humor became operational tools. The remark, though made long after everyone reading those reports had returned to civilian life, captured what soldiers instinctively felt. In the months following the German surrender, Allied hospitals filled with captured soldiers. Many of these men had seen or heard of American corpsmen who defied hostility to treat them. One such former Panzer gunner, possibly among the rescued 12, confessed to an interrogator that he could not reconcile the medic's laughter with propaganda images of enemy cruelty. "I was raised to see the Americans as mechanized barbarians," he said. "But that man laughed like my brother used to. It was terrible and beautiful." That contradiction traveled home with him, shaping veterans' memories long after defeat. Cultural memory often exaggerates individual heroism, but the Ghost's legend remained curiously modest. There were no official decorations, no monument. His fame lived through fragments. A note in a battalion log, a line of oral testimony archived at Carlisle Barracks, a fleeting mention in a 1947 Army medical newsletter. One unidentified aide man at Bastogne reportedly rescued 12 during tank fires, displaying extraordinary composure. In later decades, when military medics trained for Vietnam and Iraq, instructors occasionally retold the Ardennes story as folklore, stripped of names yet rich in principle. It reminded trainees that medicine in combat was not passive or safe. It demanded the same ferocity as assault, directed toward life rather than death. Humor, resilience, and precision replaced aggression, but the spirit was identical. Outside military circles, historians re-examined the moral texture of the war. Beneath global strategy charts and casualty curves, they found moments where compassion altered local outcomes. A British writer compared these to spontaneous truces, emerging whenever basic humanity overwhelmed strategic logic. The Ghost's 30 minutes of mutual rescue during the Bastogne fighting joined that small catalogue of inexplicable decency, where antagonists forgot who was supposed to hate whom. By the time post-war Europe rebuilt hospitals and roads over old battlefields, villagers around the Ardennes crossroads still remembered the winter of 1944, children playing near rusted. Tank hulks heard the oldest residents speak of a man with a red cross who laughed at death. Whether translation embellished or diluted the truth no longer mattered. The story had absorbed geography. It became part of the land's folklore, alongside legends far older than the war itself. Today, historians approach the ghost as composite symbol rather than literal biography, the collective courage of thousands condensed into a single image. Yet the archival traces verify more than myth. Someone truly crossed that burning road. 12 wounded men were indeed logged as evacuated alive from an otherwise fatal zone. That convergence of records anchors the legend to fact, and through it, laughter becomes evidence as real as any photograph. In modern military medicine, that laughter echoes quietly in procedure and ethos. The insistence that compassion is a force multiplier, that calm presence can stabilize more than tourniquets ever could. Each medic who steadies trembling hands under incoming fire channels a lineage that began long before they were born, in a forest lit by burning armor and snowfall. The ghost vanished into history without ceremony, but his legacy continues through every medic's instinct to step forward when logic demands retreat. Thus, the official battles may have ended in 1945, yet his defiance, in refusing despair, in laughing instead, became an endless act of resistance against the inhumanity of war itself. Winter has long since surrendered the Ardennes to silence. The forests that once roared with armor now whisper with wind and memory. Visitors walking among preserved wrecks rarely imagine the noise, the heat, or the fleeting humanity that once flickered there. Yet, if one listens closely to the crunch of snow, the pulse of distant church bells, it is possible to sense what survivors described as the heartbeat that refused to stop. The ghost's laughter became shorthand for that refusal. It was not joy nor defiance of faith. It was the language of endurance. Each chuckle drawn through smoke declared, "I am still choosing life." In that sense, the medic was less a man of mystery than an emblem of medicine itself, an art of salvaging in the face of entropy. When historians speak of World War II heroism, they often honor those who destroyed the enemy's strength. The medic in Bastogne reminds us there is another measure of victory: the simple act of saving someone who should not have survived. Laughter, in his case, became an anesthesia administered to everyone within earshot, a shared assurance that compassion still functioned, even under artillery. Across cultures and generations, soldiers later found fragments of themselves in that image. Paramedics in Vietnam and missile-era corpsmen alike recognized the same pattern. Hands working automatically, while the mind steadies itself with humor close to despair. The ghost's lesson was timeless, that composure is contagious, and mercy can radiate outward like shock waves, quiet yet unstoppable. So the war closed, but the echo endures. Somewhere among the fallen leaves of the Ardennes lies the invisible line where hatred paused for breath and laughter filled the gap. It marked a boundary not between armies, but between darkness and decency. Proof that even in history's harshest winter, a single human being could illuminate the battlefield simply by remembering how to care.